Bert, physics tells us about the physical world, and trained as a scientist, I understand that. But philosophy has a different approach, and I've talked to some analytical philosophers. But what does a phenomenologist tell us that can help illuminate the world of physics?
Well, it's a hard job for phenomenology. I worried about it a lot because I started out in physics, and I really think there are galaxies and electrons out there, and if any philosophy position comes along and tells us there aren't, that's bad news. And in fact, Husserl was an idealist, and therefore, in a certain sense, was saying ultimate reality isn't made up of physical particles and such. And most people think Heidegger's an idealist because Heidegger, with his notion of being in the world, says that we are always coping with things, dealing with things, totally involved. But the things aren't the physical things that science studies. They're doors and the doorknobs and benches and chairs and so forth. And we have skills for coping with all that stuff. And we also have skills for coping with scientific equipment and skills for coping with particles in the sense of making bubble chambers where they show paths and so forth. But it sounds like it's all inside of our shared world. Inside being in the world, there are even these scientists studying these particles. But we couldn't possibly, could we have access to those particles outside of our being in the world? What would we have to do? Well, Heidegger thinks we'd have to de-world things. And we can de-world things, and that's how it's going to work. He goes through a quick story about how when you use a hammer, you can, if you're really skilled and you're good at it and the wood is good and so forth, the hammer withdraws, the job withdraws, there's just hammering going on, sort of Zen-like. But if something goes wrong with the hammer, it could be too heavy, then you see that there's this object and it's got this property of too heavy. But that's still inside the world we all share. But then there are techniques for just dealing with something in a way that is just staring at it, not paying attention to, even if it's a broken hammer, it's still you paying attention to it as it should be a hammer. Even if you're just staring at it, it's your way, your visual capacities that enable it to look like a hammer. Can we just ignore all of that and say that we're going to de-world and just get to the pure data? Heidegger thinks, yeah, but the pure data isn't science yet. You've got to, after you have stared at something in this completely detached way, you've got to put it back together again in a theory. So Heidegger's got a very sophisticated philosophy of science, in fact. He thinks, as philosophers of science say, the entities in science are theory-laden. You've got to, an electron only makes sense within a theory about fields and a theory about molecules and so forth.
What does that mean? Does that mean it doesn't have an independent existence other than through our theory?
No, that's the point. It exists independent of our theory. Now, how are we going to say that? That's the right question. Well, you've got to have a story of how we gain access to it, which doesn't mean that the way we gain access to it is constitutive of what it is. That's the trick.
Okay.
So Heidegger has a notion of what he calls formal indication, which he worked at and he thought was very important. Formal indicating something is to find some property of it, which is, in fact, relative to you looking for properties. But then you can investigate it more and more, and you can discover other properties of it that are its essential properties of it, and make no essential reference to how you got there. Your access is contingent. If there are natural kinds, as they're called, in the world, I'll give you an example in a minute, which have essential properties, then you can de-world, you can leave behind your access. So Heidegger got it on his own, but an analytic philosopher who's worked it out is Saul Kripke. He has a similar term. Heidegger talks about formal indication. Kripke talks about rigid designation. And I'll now use a Kripke example. You take something, his example is gold, and you say, I'm going to investigate that gold stuff. And you pick it out by being gold stuff. But that's relevant to your access and your interests and your perception.
Right.
And you discover there's stuff that isn't gold-colored, which somehow still seems to belong with that, and stuff that is gold-colored, iron pyrites, which don't. And investigating enough, you discover there is something that explains all the properties of gold, namely it has atomic weight of, I think, 72. That means it's the essential property for something to be gold is to have that property. And it has that property whether you got there by some other property or not. It's got that property independent of the theory even. The theory tells you that there could be that.
So the key is to find that one essential property or however many essential properties, and that's the key.
That's right, to getting outside the world, to de-world.
Yeah.
And it only will work. And if there are no natural kinds, and we have no guarantee there are, you can't do it. You've got to believe that there are. Let me give another example. So you believe that heat is some feeling of warmth and so forth, and you investigate and you investigate. Finally, you think heat is the vibration of molecules. Well, if that's only true if heat is a natural kind which has an essence. But if it does, then you can say all I went through to get there has nothing to do with it being that. And even this role in a theory doesn't make it heat. Heat's a natural kind, and it would be there if we had never existed and if our theories had never existed.
So that's the way to break through the world and our own participation in it to get to the essence of a thing? I mean,
that's right.
Are you really getting to the essence of a thing, which Kant said you couldn't get to?
Yes, if you can explain all of its other relevant properties so that you can discover everything, and you need everything gold is its ductility, its conductivity, its being yellow in these conditions, it's not dissolving in anything but aqua regia, whatever that story is. If you can explain all that, then we should conclude that there is a natural kind, and we know its essence. And that's the way you can start with being in the world, but not be trapped by the fact that you had to get to there by your own properties and so forth. And most people think that Heidegger can't do it, but I think with his notion of rigid designation, he can. And the interesting thing is Heidegger loved physics. He was a friend of Heisenberg's. I discovered that he was a physics math major as an undergraduate. His first papers were all on logic, and I think Heidegger would be glad to see that Kripke's worked out what Heidegger called formal indication.
So how then does phenomenology enhance our understanding of the physical world?
Okay. Well, phenomenology doesn't really enhance our understanding of the physical world. That's the job of the physicist. But it enables us to understand that there could be a physical world with properties that can be studied by the physicist. And that's ingenious and amazing of Heidegger to have, I think, managed to make this work. I think he wants to because I think he likes physics, and any sensible person would. And he knows Heisenberg, they're friends, and he was a major in physics and math as an undergraduate. And he talks about, his phrase is pure discovery. Pure discovery means we can find out how things are, utterly independent of our way of access to them, and utterly independent of the theory in which enables us to gain access to how they are. And if there are natural kinds. And then we talked about how he makes this move by what he called formal indication. You can talk about something without knowing anything about it, just pick it out by any old property, and then when you learn more and more, if it has an essential property, and you find it, then you know that's how that thing is. An electron has a charge, it has a spin, it has a weight, whether anybody was ever around or not, or whether we ever had a theory about electrons. And that's great, but now we have to be careful, because Heidegger is not a materialist. How is he going to avoid ending up saying, well, it's all really discovered by physics then, and now there's no job for phenomenologists? Well, phenomenologists have to describe our world, our practices, our access to the physical world, and they have to understand that what we discover when we discover the natural kinds in the physical world can't explain Dasein and its understanding of its own being and its use of equipment and all the things that go to make up being in the world. That's the sense in which being in the world is basic, even though physical science is true.